The Fifth State of the Union Address. Washington's Fifth Annual Message to Congress. Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, December 3rd, 1793. Fellow citizens of the Senate and the House of Representatives, since the commencement of the term for which I have been again called into office, no fit occasion has arisen for expressing to me, fellow citizens at large, the deep and respectful sense which I feel of the renewed testimony of the public approbation. While on the one hand it awakened my gratitude for all those instances of affectionate partiality with which I have been honored by my country, on the other hand, it could not prevent an earnest wish for that retirement from which no private consideration should ever have torn me. But influenced by the belief that my conduct would be estimated according to its real motives, and that the people and the authorities derived from them would support exertions having nothing personal for the object, I have obeyed the suffrage which commanded me to resume the executive power, and I humbly implore that being, on whose will the fate of nations depends, to crown with success our mutual endeavors for the general happiness. As soon as the war in Europe had embraced those powers with whom the United States have the most extensive relations, there was reason to apprehend that our intercourse with them might be interrupted, and our disposition for peace drawn into question by the suspicions too often entertained by belligerent nations. It seemed, therefore, to be my duty to admonish our citizens of the consequences of a contraband trade and of hostile acts to any of the parties, and to obtain by a declaration of the existing legal state of things an easier admission of our right to the immunities belonging to our situation. Under these impressions, the proclamation which will be laid before you was issued. In this posture of affairs, both new and delicate, I resolved to adopt general rules which should conform to the treaties and assert the privileges of the United States. These were reduced into a system which will be communicated to you. Although I have not thought of myself at liberty to forbid the sale of the prizes permitted by our treaty of commerce with France to be brought into our ports, I have not refused to cause them to be restored when they were taken within the protection of our territory, or by vessels commissioned or equipped in a warlike form within the limits of the United States. It rests with the wisdom of Congress to correct, improve, or enforce this plan of procedure, and it will probably be found expedient to extend the legal code and the jurisdiction of the courts of the United States to many cases which, though dependent on principles already recognized, demand some further provisions, where individuals shall, within the United States, array themselves in hostility against any of the powers at war, or enter upon military expeditions or enterprises within the jurisdiction of the United States, or usurp and exercise judicial authority within the United States, or where the penalties on violations of the law of nations may have been indistinctly marked or are inadequate. These offenses cannot receive too early and close an attention, and require prompt and decisive remedies. Whatsoever those remedies may be, they will be well administered by the judiciary, who possesses a long-established course of investigation, effectual process, and officers in the habit of executing it. In like manner, as several of the courts have doubted, under particular circumstances, their power to liberate the vessels of a nation at peace, and even of a citizen of the United States, although seized under a false color of being hostile property, and have denied their power to liberate certain captures within the protection of our territory, it would seem proper to regulate their jurisdiction in these points. But if the executive is to be the resort in either of the two last mentioned cases, it is hoped that he will be authorized by law to have facts ascertained by the courts when for his own information he shall request it. I cannot recommend to your notice measures for the fulfillment of our duties to the rest of the world without again pressing upon you the necessity of placing ourselves in a condition of complete defense, and of exacting from them the fulfillment of their duties towards us. The United States ought not to indulge in persuasion that, contrary to the order of human events, they will forever keep at a distance those painful appeals to arms with which the history of every other nation abounds. There is a rank due to the United States among nations which will be withheld, if not absolutely lost, by the reputation of weakness. If we desire to avoid insult, we must be able to repel it. If we desire to secure peace, one of the most powerful instruments of our rising prosperity, it must be known that we are at all times ready for war. The documents which will be presented to you will show the amount and kinds of arms and military stores now in our magazines and arsenals, and yet an addition even to these supplies cannot with prudence be neglected, as it would leave nothing to the uncertainty of procuring warlike apparatus in the moment of public danger. Nor can such arrangements with such objects be exposed to the censure or jealousy of the warmest friends of republican government. They are incapable of abuse in the hands of the militia, who ought to possess a pride in being the depository of the force of the republic, and may be trained to a degree of energy equal to every military exigency of the United States. But it is an inquiry which cannot be too solemnly pursued, whether the act more effectually to provide for the national defense by establishing a uniform militia throughout the United States has organized them so as to produce their full effect. Whether your own experience in the several states has not detected some imperfections in the scheme, and whether a material feature in an improvement of it ought not to be to afford an opportunity for the study of those branches of the military art which can scarcely ever be attained by practice alone. The connection of the United States with Europe has become extremely interesting. The occurrences which relate to it and have passed under the knowledge of the executive will be exhibited to Congress in a subsequent communication. When we contemplate the war on our frontiers, it may be truly affirmed that every reasonable effort has been made to adjust the causes of dissension with the Indians north of the Ohio. The instructions given to the commissioners evince a moderation and equity proceeding from a sincere love of peace, and a liberality having no restriction but the essential interests and dignity of the United States. The attempt, however, of an amicable negotiation having been frustrated, the troops have marched to act offensively. Although the proposed treaty did not attest the progress of military preparation, it is doubtful how far the advance of the season, before good faith justified active movements, may retard them during the remainder of the year. From the papers and intelligence which relate to this important subject, you will determine whether the deficiency in the number of troops granted by law shall be compensated by successors of militia, or additional encouragements shall be proposed to recruits. An anxiety has also been demonstrated by the executive for peace with the Creeks and the Cherokees. The former have been relieved with corn and with clothing, and offensive measures against them prohibited during the recess of Congress. To satisfy the complaints of the latter, prosecutions have been instituted for the violences committed upon them. But the papers which will be delivered to you disclose the critical footing on which we stand in regards to both those tribes, and it is with Congress to pronounce what shall be done. After they shall have provided for the present emergency, it will merit their most serious labors to render tranquillity with the savages permanent by creating ties of interest. Next to a rigorous execution of justice on the violators of peace, the establishment of commerce with the Indian nations in behalf of the United States is most likely to conciliate their attachment. But it ought to be conducted without fraud or extortion, with constant and plentiful supplies, with a ready market for the commodities of the Indians, and a stated price for what they give in payment and receive in exchange. Individuals will not pursue such a traffic unless they are allured by a hope of profit, but it will be enough for the United States to be reimbursed only. Should this recommendation accord with the opinion of Congress, they will recollect that it cannot be accomplished by any means yet in the hands of the executive. Gentlemen of the House of Representatives, the commissioners charged with the settlement of accounts between the United States and individual states concluded their important function within the time limited by law, and the balances struck in the report, which will be laid before Congress, have been placed on the books of the Treasury. On the 1st day of June last, an installment of 1,000,000 florins became payable on the loans of the United States and Holland. This was adjusted by a prolongation of the period of reimbursement in nature of a new loan at an interest rate of 5% for the term of 10 years, and the expenses of this operation were a commission of 3%. The first installment of a loan of $2 million from the Bank of the United States has been paid, as it was directed by law. For the second, it is necessary that provision be made. No pecuniary consideration is more urgent than the regular redemption and discharge of the public debt. On none can delay be more injurious or an economy of time more valuable. The productiveness of the public revenues hitherto has continued to equal the anticipations which were formed of it, but it is not expected to prove commensurate with all the objects which have been suggested. Some auxiliary provisions will, therefore, it is presumed, be requisite, and it is hoped that these may be made consistently with a due regard to the convenience of our citizens, who cannot but be sensible of the true wisdom of encountering a small present addition to their contributions to obviate a future accumulation of burthens. But here I cannot forbear to recommend a repeal of the tax on the transportation of public prints. There is no resource so firm for the government of the United States as the affections of the people, guided by enlightened policy, and to this primary good nothing can conduce more than a faithful representation of public proceedings diffused without restraint throughout the United States, an estimate of the appropriations necessary for the current service of the ensuing year, and a settlement of a purchase of arms and military stores made during the recess will be presented to Congress. Gentlemen of the Senate and the House of Representatives, the several subjects to which I have now referred open a wide range to your deliberations and involve some of the choicest interests of our common country. Permit me to bring to your remembrance the magnitude of your task. Without an unprejudiced coolness, the welfare of the government may be hazarded. Without harmony, as far as consists with freedom of sentiment, its dignity may be lost. But as the legislative proceedings of the United States will never, I trust, be reproached for the want of temper or of candor, so shall not the public happiness languish from the want of my strenuous and warmest cooperation. George Washington. Senate reply to the President of the United States, December 9th, 1793. At 12 o'clock, agreeably to appointment, the Senate waited on the President at his house and presented the following address. Accept, sir, the thanks of the Senate for your speech delivered to both houses of Congress at the opening of the session. Your re-election to the chief magistracy, we consider it as an event every way propitious to the happiness of our country, and your compliance with the call as a fresh instance of the patriotism which has repeatedly led you to sacrifice private inclination to the public good, and the unanimity which a second time marks this important national act, we trace with particular satisfaction, besides the distinguished tribute paid to the virtues and abilities which it recognizes, another proof of that just discernment and constancy of sentiments and views which have hitherto characterized the citizens of the United States. As the European powers with whom the United States have the most extensive relations were involved in a war in which we had taken no part, it seemed necessary that the disposition of the nation for peace should be promulgated to the world, as well for the purpose of admonishing our citizens of the consequences of a contraband trade and of acts hostile to any of the belligerent parties, as to obtain by a declaration of existing legal state of things an easier admission of our rights to the immunities of our situation. We therefore contemplate with pleasure the proclamation by you issued, and give it our hearty approbation. We deem it a measure well timed and wise, manifesting a watchful solicitude for the welfare of the nation and calculated to promote it. The several important matters presented to our consideration will, in the course of the session, engage all the attention to which they were respectively entitled, and as the public happiness will be the sole guide of our deliberations, we are perfectly assured of receiving your strenuous and most zealous cooperation. John Adams, Vice President of the United States and President of the Senate. Reply from the United States House of Representatives, 7th of December, 1793. Sir, the representatives of the people of the United States, in meeting you for the first time since you have been again called by unanimous suffrage to your present station, find an occasion which they embrace with no less sincerity than promptitude for expressing to you their congratulations on so distinguished a testimony of public approbation, and their entire confidence in the purity and patriotism of the motives which have produced this obedience to the voice of your country. It is two virtues which have commanded long and universal reverence, and services from which have flowed great and lasting benefits, that the tribute of praise may be paid. Without the reproach of flattery, it is from the same sources that the fairest anticipations may be derived in favor of the public happiness. The United States, having taken no part in the war which had embraced in Europe the powers with whom they have the most extensive relations, the maintenance of peace was justly to be regarded as one of the most important duties of the magistrate charged with the faithful execution of the laws. We accordingly witness the approbation and pleasure of the vigilance with which you have guarded against an interruption of that blessing. By your proclamation, admonishing our citizens of the consequences of illicit or hostile acts towards the belligerent parties, and promoting by a declaration of the existing legal state of things an easier admission of our rights to the immunities belonging to our situation. The connection of the United States with Europe has evidently become extremely interesting. The communications which remain to be exhibited to us will, no doubt, assist in giving us a fuller view of the subject, and in guiding our deliberations to such results as may comport with the rights and true interests of the country. We learn with great regret that the measures dictated by a love of peace for obtaining an amicable termination of the afflicting war on our frontier have been frustrated, and that a resort to offensive measures has again become necessary. As the latter, however, must be rendered more satisfactory in proportion to the solicitude for peace manifested by the former. It is to be hoped they will be pursued under the better auspices on that account, and be finally crowned with more happy success. In relation to the particular tribes of Indians against whom offensive measures have been prohibited, as well as all the other important subjects which you have presented to our view, we shall bestow the attention which they claim. We cannot, however, refrain at this time from particularly expressing our concurrence in your anxiety for the regular discharge of the public debts, as fast as circumstances and events will permit, and in the policy of removing any impediments which may be found in the way of a faithful representation of public proceedings throughout the United States. Being persuaded with you that on no subject more than the former can delay be more injurious, or an economy of time more valuable, and that with respect to the latter, no resource is so firm with the government of the United States as the affections of the people, guided by an enlightened policy. Throughout our deliberations, we shall endeavor to cherish with every sentiment which may contribute to render them conducive to the dignity as well as to the welfare of the United States. And we join with you in imploring that Being on whose will the fate of nations depends to crown with success our mutual endeavors. Signed by order and in behalf of the House, Frederick Augustus Muhlenberg, Speaker.